Hi there, I'm Peter. I'm going to show you how to do some culturing techniques 101 for fungi.
So to gather a couple of things, you're first going to want to get your cultures or samples that you're going to be working with, as well as some fresh media. I'm going to be using malt extract agar plus antibiotics denoted by the red-black line. You're going to want some parafilm to close up your plates. You're going to want a fine point permanent marker to label those plates, and a scissors to cut your parafilm. Depending on how you're going to sanitize the tools you're going to use, you may want a lighter or matches to light perhaps a Bunsen burner, as well as something to block the airflow, protect the flame of that Bunsen burner. On top of that, you're going to want your tools. We'll go over that in a second. And something to put your tools in, a reservoir that will also hold, along with your tools, some 90 to 95% alcohol. It needs to be that percentage so that it will burn off and sterilize your tools correctly. Put your tools back in there. You're also going to want a sprayer of 70% alcohol, which is better for sanitizing surfaces than a higher percentage once it dries. You're also going to want some paper towels, of course, to wipe things up, and a beaker or a glass disc to put your sanitized tools on when they are ready. Next, we're going to want to turn on our hood so that we get airflow and the light so we can see things, and then we're going to spray the inside with our 70% alcohol to sanitize the surfaces, starting from the top and then working our way down and across to make sure we spray all those surfaces, and then along the base of the table of the inside of the hood. Once everything is all sprayed, you need to let the hood run for 15 to 20 minutes to purge out all the stale air before use. It's also important to note that when working with 70% alcohol, it does not sanitize on contact, but rather once you spray it, you need to let it dry first. Like this spot here, that part was sprayed and is dry, is now sanitized, but this wet spot is not dry yet, it is not sanitized yet.
So, as we're setting up the hoods here, anything that we bring outside into the hood here, I like to spray it down while that hood is still purging out its air. So, for example, I'm bringing this Bunsen burner, I'm going to give my 70% alcohol. I'm going to give it a spray down. You should give it bits. You can even take the paper towel, do a little quick wipe of it to dry off and fully sanitize it. And then I'm going to put that here. And so while it continues to put this here, I'm going to now take all the other stuff, spray it down, get it in the bed, let it dry off, and sanitize.
All right, let's talk about the different tools that I typically like to use. What tools you use is really dependent upon who's culturing and a preference. It's not a big deal as long as you can sanitize it and use it. My personal favorite is the micro spatula. I think it does well to cut out a little auger squares or pull up plugs, and I use the pointy end. Another thing that people use is a scalpel or something like a scalpel like this, and they like those ones, especially if you're working with cultures that are pretty leathery and difficult to cut. Another common one is a cork borer or an auger plug, and this just makes nice, perfect little cookie cutter circles for you to pull up and then place into your cultures. You're going to put that in your reservoir with 95 or 90% alcohol and put that way off to the side. So quick little demo, we're going to light the Bunsen burner, make sure the gas is on. The flame doesn't need to be really big or tall, a short flame works perfectly fine. You want to tap off the excess alcohol, and then you're going to stick it in the flame, and then make sure you keep the tool pointed down so that the flame licks up the tool and sanitizes sanitizes more of the tool itself. I'll also sanitize the cork borer here. Sometimes a little bit more, the alcohol gets stuck on the inside. Make sure you never return it immediately back to the reservoir, because then that can start your reservoir on fire, which is a little freaky, but not a big deal. You just cover it with a glass disc. And then I set it on the beaker and it was ready to go. All right, let's talk about labeling plates. So I label my plates pretty specifically. I like to write on the lid of the plate, and I like to write from the edge that denotes the media type, so the black red line here. And I do that so I know where to find my label. I like to label my plate straight across the plate. Some people like to label across or along the edges so you can still see the cultures. Some people like to label on the back side of the plate. I do not like labeling on the back side of the plate in case I want to take a picture, because then the text would show through the bottom of the plate. Some people say that it's better that way because then you don't have misplaced cultures if you happen to misplace your lid. So I write my dates or my labels always starting with my initials, and then I write the date, and I do include the year because sometimes cultures can get pretty old, more than a year. So I do mine starting in a kind of weird way. I do the year, the month, and then I do the day. And I do cross my zeros because I think it is a little clearer when I'm trying to figure out if something's a 0 or an O. Following that is going to be the information specific to the isolate that you're transferring. So here, grapevine isolate, GI, I think I'm going to be transferring 250, but you can put whatever sort of sample or information that you need to do. I would recommend just keeping that a pretty short label though, and then keeping a Excel file with all the metadata referring to that specific shorter label. All right, so apparently I lied. The culture I'm actually transferring is GI31. This culture has already been used, but that's okay. I'm going to unwrap it very gently because I want to try to reuse my parafilm. That is something I like to do. You don't have to do that. It's a little extra work, but I think it's worth it. And then I put the culture that I'm going to be transferring from, or the sample, off to my left, and then the new clear plate off to my right. It doesn't really matter which side, as long as you're consistent and it works for you. I then take my sterilized or sanitized cork bore, and then normally I would do this by holding the plate with one hand and actually lifting it up, but that is kind of a more advanced technique I would not recommend, especially for just starting out. So instead, it's better recommended you just leave the plate itself onto the table of the hood, and then opening it up, just holding the lid. And you can actually use the lid this way as sort of a shield so that you don't accidentally breathe on your culture and contaminate it. And then I'm going to cookie cutter out some nice auger plugs that I'm going to be using to transfer. And then the cork bore now needs to be re-sanitized. So I dip it into the 90% alcohol, I flame it, and then I get off the excess, and then I'll put that back onto my tools ready to go beaker. Okay, so now we have our sterilized tool, our micro spatula. You can re-sterilize it if you're not really sure. It's always better to re-sterilize than to not. And we're going to transfer one of those auger plugs to the fresh media. It may be kind of hard to see, and it may be kind of hard to hold your culture, so you may need to like lift it a little bit to try to get the light angle right to see where the plug is. You can use your pinky like I am to help stabilize it. Pick up one of those plugs gently, and importantly, there is more hyphae at the top of the plug than there is at the bottom of the plug. So when we plate this onto the new media, we want to put it top side down, so the side with more hyphae facing downward onto the new clean media, and that will allow it to spread and colonize more effectively onto the new plate. You lift it up, flip it over, and then you can place it down. A lot of people put it in the center. Sometimes I like to put mine off to the side. Doesn't really matter where, as long as you works for you. Then re-sterilize your tools and put it on your beaker. Now, people will cut parafilm in various ways. So I'm going to show you two different ways. The most common way, which is to cut them into these little individual strips here at the laboratory text, and then also at this blue line here. And these little strips are good for closing up one individual plate. However, I tend to do a lot more cultures all at once, so I'll actually make these much longer strips, and each strip is good for multiple cultures. And I will cut this into fourths at the center between that cube, and then at the center between the two cubes. And then once I have my little pilot cuts, I bring out a lot more, and I will strip up these parafilm bits to the top. And how long these strips are is really dependent on how many cultures I think I'm going to need to seal for that day. Then once they're stripped at the top, I like to cut all the way across, and now I have 4 long strips, each good for a couple cultures each.
Okay, so next I will show you how to actually use one of these strips to from at least how I like to do it. So it can be kind of hard to get the backing off, so I like to flick it a couple of times, crumble it, and then normally get the backing come off. And then we have our strip. We can use this to then paraffin our plate. Here I just have outline plate for the demonstration. I always like to parafilm starting at the lines that is denoting what the actual media type is. And then you're going to want to pull it, but you don't want to pull it too tight. You just want to loosen it up. And then you don't want to pull it tight all the way around. You actually want to give it, once you stretch it, give it some slack, and then just sort of lightly rest it around the edge of the parafilm, or around the plate. And then like that. And then you can kind of go around with your finger and make sure it's flat. And then you want to inspect the underside to make sure that there are no holes or tears or rips. One thing I don't like about this particular style of parafilming is that it goes all the way down to the edge, and it can get kind of sticky when you're stacking a bunch of plates all together, and it's a little cumbersome, and it can also lead to tearing. Also, then you only have one single layer of parafilm protecting you from a tear. So alternatively to using parafilm kind of in the standard way, another thing you can do, and I will show you with one of these longer strips that I prepared that I typically use more often than the short strips, because then I can just use this for multiple plates. You can do that sort of like wiggle off, get it off, but you can also take your 70% alcohol and you can spray the backing, wipe it, and then that will actually make it easier to come right off like that. And then it also helps to sanitize your hair before, so it's nice. I give it a couple of wipes. And then what I do with this is I will actually fold it in half, hot dog ways, and I'll give it a little crease. I'll line it up like that. And then, so by comparison, so this is a double thickness, half width parafilm, and I like to use this on my cultures instead. So similarly, to get my culture here, starting at the lines denoting the media type, and then put my thumb here, and then again, same idea, you pull to loosen it, and then you want to just lightly, gently lay it down. And while you're doing this, especially because this one's a little thinner, you want to make sure that you're getting right at the gap there, making sure that you're covering that gap. And then you're at the halfway point, you do another stretch, release some tension so that you don't cause too much. And then once you're at the end here and you've covered over that, you're going to still have extra if you cut it the way that I did. And so I like to pull back on it to tear it, and I can use the remainder for another culture. And then on this, I have a little tab that I like to roll backwards a little bit so that I know exactly, I'll leave a little nubbin so that I know exactly when I'm going to go open this culture next time where to pull. And then that leaves it so that it will be reusable at least a couple of times, which is my preferred way of doing this.
To re-demonstrate how I use my parafilm to seal up my plates, I'll do it here in the hood. You can see this piece down here is from my original culture. Like I said, I like to reuse my parafilm if I can. I have a long strip here like I like it. I'm going to spray the back, wipe it, and then wiggle off the backing. Can be a little cumbersome at times, but generally spraying it works better than trying to get it off yourself. Then I'll wipe it a few more times until it's dried, because it is not sanitized until the alcohol has dried, and then I'll fold it hot dog wise, lining up the edges to make sure that it is even thickness along the whole thing. Then starting at the media lines, I will put my thumb there, and then I'll pull to stretch, loosen, let up tension, and then lightly lay it down. Halfway point, same thing, stretch and then loosen to let up tension, and then lightly lay it down. I'll get back to those media lines, I'll pull it, stretch a little bit more, and then I'll back pull it, and then that little leftover bit can be used for another culture. And then this little flag left over of parafilm, I will take it and I will do a back roll, which will leave this little nub that I can find easily next time I need to open this culture. And also you want to inspect the bottom, especially that little gap area, to make sure there's no holes or rips and that it is fully sealed. Now, to denote how to reuse this parafilm later, like I'm going to be doing for this culture, you can see that this has a slight curve to it, and the curve goes downward, kind of like a rainbow. So the shorter edge is downwards and the longer edge is upwards. And if you're careful, you'll remember what side came off first. It's also the side without the nubbin. So that's the side we're going to start with. And again, we're going to start at those media type lines. And since this is already stretched, we don't want to re-stretch it again. We just want to lightly lay it down back along the open edge of the plate and then close it and stick it there. And then again, running your finger along that edge to make sure that it's fully sealed up. I then like to stack these two plates together, the original culture and the transfer culture, and I check it in a week or so to make sure that the new culture looks like the original culture. Here is my full setup, and I'll do a one shot to kind of give you a sense of the kind of flow. So you want your 70% alcohol, spray your hands frequently and rub them together, get all the crevices and nooks, and then once they are fully dry, then they are considered sanitized. You're also going to want your strips ready on deck, and you're going to want your tools of your preferred choice. I have my micro spatula, cork borer, and another little tool, and we're going to put that in our reservoir with the higher percentage 90% alcohol, which is better for sanitizing or for sterilizing by burning off the alcohol for our tools. And remember to place that reservoir far away from your flame. You don't want to start it on fire, but if you do, take out the tools calmly and then just cover it with a plate. You're going to set your tool on fire, and you're going to want that tool pointing downwards so that the flame licks up and sanitizes a little bit further up on the tool. Once that tool is out of flame, you can set it down on your glass beaker, noting that it is ready. Over here I have some media that I have taken out of its bag, as well as my cultures that I'm going to transfer. The ones that are to be transferred are on the left, and the ones that are done are slightly more off to the right. Now, when you are working in the hood, you don't want anything behind you in the little work area that you are doing, and this is to make sure that you maintain airflow. Now, I usually prepare my plates that I'm going to use with the initials and the date, like I've mentioned before, and then I grab the top culture that I'm transferring. This one is going to be Grapevine Isolate 408, so that is GI 408. But first, we're going to put my initials, date, and then we will put the actual culture that I am transferring. Again, this is your sample information, whatever, but keep it short and then maintain an Excel file that has more information about that specific culture. Cap our permanent marker, and then I'm going to put our transfer or the clean culture we're transferring into off to the side since we don't need it right now. I'm going to gently open my plate so that I can reuse the parafilm. Set it off down to the bottom there so it's out of the way. Respray my hands because why not? You never really know. Frequently re-sanitizing your hands with the 70% alcohol is pretty good practice. I'm going to actually need my cork borer for this, so I'm going to take it out of the reservoir and then I'm going to flame it and then kind of get some of that excess alcohol off since it gets kind of stuck in there on the inside. You can even double flame it to make sure that you fully get all the alcohol off. Keep your lid, hold the lid, and you can use it as a little protector from your breath, as I've mentioned before, while you are cutting out your little circles, if you use a cork borer at all, or whatever tool you happen to be using. In more advanced ways, you could do it one-handed. That is going to take some practice. It is not recommended for beginners, but I will be doing that here because that's typically how I will culture things, and also I can get the culture a little closer to the camera so you can see those nice little cookie cutter auger plugs that I can now use for transferring. I like to cut more than I actually end up using. I'm going to put that back into our reservoir, and then I'm going to grab my prepared micro spatula, and I am going to turn so the auger plugs are facing up and away from me, which is a little easier to navigate. And then stabilizing with that pinky, I'm going to pick up one of my auger plugs, and this, notice, has more hyphae at the top than it does at the bottom, though all of the auger has been pigmented black by this particular culture. So when we plate this onto our new plate, we're going to want to put the hyphae side, or the more hyphae side, downward. And some people will put them into the center. I like to sometimes put them slightly off to the side because then I can see it growing down and across the full length of the culture. But this is really preference. It's totally up to you where you want to place your auger plug. Then you want to set it down, make sure it's fully adhered and it doesn't, get knocked around or anything. And then sometimes you have a little bit of extra stuff left over on your micro spatula, so you're going to want to put it back into your reservoir and give it a little mix stir to make sure you're getting off all the little bits before you reflame it, and then you put it on to your beaker to be ready. Now we have our cultures ready to be resealed. So we're first going to use this long strip that I like to cut. I'm going to spray the backing with my 70% alcohol, wipe it down, and then I'm going to take off that backing, wipe it again to make sure that the alcohol is dried. And then I'm folding it hot dog wise, lining up those edges and making that crease so that it maintains its shape. Once I got that all done, I'm going to take the end of that, I'm going to line it up with those media lines on my new culture, and I'm going to do a little stretch and then relieve tension, and then lightly lay it along the edges, making sure we seal up that gap. And then once we're at the halfway point, that gap in particular is important to close. You don't want it wrapping on the top or the bottom, otherwise the plate will stick in the stack, which is a little annoying. At that halfway point, stretch again, relieve tension, lightly lay it down along that edge, and then back pull it once you're over the media line where the beginning of the parafilm is. We have a nice long strip left over for other plates, and then that little flag of parafilm, we can take it and back roll it into a little tab or a nubbin, as I've been saying, and then that'll make it easier to open up later. So this culture then goes into the done pile, and then we need to rewrap the original culture with its original parafilm. As I said, this has a slightly shorter edge and a slightly longer edge. It's kind of shaped like a rainbow, and the shorter edge goes down and the longer edge goes up. You take that flatter side that was last pulled off on the culture, and again starting at those media lines, and this time no restretching. Make sure that you cover up that gap and just lightly wrap it around the plate and then stick it to itself on the other side. Make sure you can run your finger along that edge to make sure it's fully sealed, and then that goes into the done pile.